Sometime this November, a man in Ohio will rake the last of his maple leaves into 18 paper yard waste bags and line them along the curb. And sometime next April, that same man will drive to the garden center, load bagged bark mulch and soil conditioner into his car, and pay for them. He isn't careless. He's doing exactly what he was taught, but he just paid twice. Once to have organic matter hauled off his property, and once to have it brought back. Penn State Extension has pointed straight at that same strange loop. So let me hand you a better question than the one most of us ask. Not what can I do with fallen leaves? That one is too easy, and it's why we end up doing a single thing with all of them. The better question is this. Before you decide what to do with a leaf, decide what job you need that leaf to perform. Because some of those leaves ought to be chopped. Some ought not to be touched at all. Some are worth letting rot slowly for the better part of a year. Some are worth keeping bone dry until the middle of next July. And a few of them ought to leave your property entirely. Same yard, same maple tree. 5 different right answers. I think the reason most of us never learned to sort leaves by job is that we were taught to think of them as food. Free fertilizer, falling out of the sky in October. That framing is a little bit true and mostly misleading, and it's why people end up disappointed. Here's a more useful way to hold it. A fallen leaf is not primarily food. It's infrastructure. Think about 3 ordinary things in your house in the middle of winter. The first is a blanket. A layer of leaves over open ground slows how fast that ground swings from warm afternoon to hard night. It slows how fast moisture evaporates out of the surface. So what should you do differently? Stop treating an empty bed as a finished bed. When you pull the last of the tomato vines out in October, that soil is not done. It's undressed. The second is a roof. When rain lands on bare soil, it hits with real force, breaks the surface apart, seals it over with a crust, and carries the finest particles off. The Natural Resources Conservation Service uses the word armor for this. Residue left lying on the surface acts as a barrier between the soil and the striking force of rain and wind, while moderating temperature extremes and cutting evaporation. So what should you do differently? After the next hard rain, walk out and find the spots where the soil is crusted and pale. Those are the places that most want a leaf layer. The third is a pantry. Every earthworm, every springtail, every fungus in that top few inches of ground eats carbon, and leaves are carbon in storage form. So what should you do differently? Put the pantry where the eaters already live, which is the surface, and let them come up to it. That's the whole reframe. Leaves do not have to feed your plants this fall in order to be worth keeping. They have to make the coming winter easier on the system that will feed your plants next summer. All right, first real decision, and it's the one that splits a yard in half. Should you shred them or leave them whole? Shredding does 3 useful things. It multiplies surface area, so decomposition speeds up. It stops broad leaves from locking together into a solid mat. And shredded leaves stay put better, especially if you wet them down after you spread them. You do not need a leaf shredder for this. Penn State Extension is plain about it. A mulching mower works best, but an ordinary mower will do. Go slowly so the blades get time to chop. Work when the leaves are reasonably dry and not piled too thick, and expect a second pass running crosswise to the first. Now here's something that surprised me the first time I read it, and it goes back a long way. Beginning in 1991, turf researchers at Michigan State University ran trials to answer the question homeowners kept asking. If you mow a whole season of tree leaves into an established lawn instead of raking them, does the lawn suffer? The short answer was no, not at the rates they studied. Turf quality on the plots treated with maple leaves actually rated better because fewer broadleaf weeds were coming up in them. Published later in a horticultural science journal. The finding was that repeatedly mulching maple and oak leaves into established Kentucky bluegrass was associated with reduced common dandelion populations under the conditions tested. Let me be careful here, because this is where people run off the road. Nobody found that maple leaves kill dandelions, and nobody found a free weed killer. What they found is that the leaves were not smothering the lawn the way homeowners feared, and that under the right conditions, mowing them in went along with fewer dandelions the following spring. They checked one more thing while they were at it. Many of us grew up being told oak leaves turn your soil acid. Across years of measurements, they did not see that shift. So here's tonight's test, from University of Minnesota Extension, who put a number on what your eyes were already telling you. Walk out and look down. Mulch leaves into the lawn as long as you can still see about half the grass surface. Once less than half your lawn is visible, Stop mowing them in and move the surplus somewhere else. Half the lawn showing, keep mowing. Lawn disappearing, move the extra. Which raises the obvious next question. If shredding is that good, why wouldn't we shred every leaf on the property? Because the leaves are already somebody's house. Illinois Extension puts it simply. Leaf litter provides insulation and shelter for insects through the cold months, including fireflies and butterflies. Moths and beetles too. They're not visiting, they're wintering. Now, this is where the good advice gets bent out of shape, so let me be precise. The instruction is not to rake your entire suburban yard and dump all of it into one wildlife corner. Penn State Extension makes exactly this point, and it stopped me cold the first time I read it. If you already have a wooded area with its own layer of fallen leaves, do not pile more leaves on top of it. Firefly larvae, overwintering insects, reptiles, amphibians, birds, and small mammals are living in that layer at a natural depth, roughly 6 to 12 inches. Burying it under another foot of imported leaves disturbs the very thing you were trying to protect. So the instruction is leave some leaves where they naturally fall. Not move every leaf you own into one enormous pile and call it habitat. A good material, in the wrong amount, in the wrong place, becomes a problem. Hold on to that one. We'll come back to it. Now let me show you the single most useful thing you can make out of leaves. And it's the thing almost nobody makes. It's called leaf mold. Leaf mold is just leaves that have been allowed to break down on their own, mostly by fungi, without being turned into a hot compost pile. When it's finished, it's dark brown. It crumbles between your fingers, and it smells like the floor of a woods after rain. Here is what it is not. It is not fertilizer, and if you go in expecting fertilizer, you will be let down. Penn State Extension says it plainly. Leaf mold is not high in nutrients. What it is an excellent soil amendment that improves the structure of the soil, increases how much water that soil will hold, and feeds the whole crowd of organisms living in it. And unlike compost or manure, it comes to you almost entirely free of weed seed. There was a field study out of Purdue University a few years back that I think about often. Researchers took degraded urban soil, the tired, compacted kind a lot of us are actually gardening on, amended part of it with leaf mold compost, and grew tomatoes across the whole trial. The amended plots showed a substantial rise in active soil organic matter. They produced more tomatoes, and there was less disease. Now that was one specific system. Degraded ground, one crop. It does not mean your backyard will respond by the same amount. What it tells you is more useful than a number anyway. This slow, humble material can change the soil environment enough that real plants notice. And the method is almost embarrassingly simple. 4 steps. Shred if it's practical. Dampen. Contain it loosely. Then walk away. For the container, there is no wrong answer. A ring of wire fencing about 3 feet across. An old trash can. A plastic bag with holes punched all over it. If the pile can sit in contact with bare ground, so much the better, because that is where the microbes are. Moisture is the one place people go wrong, so here's tonight's test. Grab a handful and squeeze. You want it damp like a wrung-out sponge. If water runs down your wrist, it's too wet. Too wet leaves go sour, they turn slick, and they pack down into a solid slab instead of crumbling. Now the honest part, which is timing. Pile whole leaves, pack them down and forget them, and you're looking at a couple of years. Shred them, keep them damp, and turn the pile now and then or throw a tarp over it, and Penn State puts it at 6 to 12 months. Illinois Extension lands in the same place with the bag method. I won't promise you beautiful compost in 6 weeks. What I'll promise is that it's the least demanding thing in your whole garden. You're trading speed for never having to do anything. All right, let's put the blanket down in the right places. In the vegetable beds, work from the surface. Clear off any obviously diseased material first, then lay shredded leaves across the top, around 2 to 4 inches, and stop there. You don't need to dig them in. That's an old instruction, and the soil health thinking has moved. The Natural Resources Conservation Service now puts minimizing soil disturbance right alongside keeping soil covered. Turning your beds over just to bury leaves works against one principle to satisfy the other. Let the organisms come up to the leaves. They will. Around trees and shrubs, same depth, 2 to 4 inches of shredded leaves, and the rule is wide, not deep. Spread it out under the canopy, and keep it off the trunk. Donut, not volcano. Mulch shoved up against bark holds moisture against that bark and gives rodents a warm, covered place to chew where you can't see them. Tonight's test for this one takes 10 seconds. Lay your hand flat on the mulch, sink your fingers in, and if it's swallowing your hand, it's too deep. Then take a rake or your boot and sweep a clear ring back from the trunk. And here's the part most of us have backward. That winter blanket is not really there to make the soil warm. Extension horticulturists in Wisconsin have made this point directly. Contrary to popular belief, winter mulch isn't about warmth. It's about keeping the root zone from freezing and thawing over and over through the winter, which is what happens in a season with little or no snow cover. Snow, when you have it, does the same job. Mulch is what you use when snow doesn't show up. That changes the practical instruction completely. When the first genuinely cold night arrives, your instinct is to run out and pile mulch deep over every perennial you own. Don't. Mulching too early keeps the ground warmer than it should be, which can slow plants from going properly dormant and leave them more vulnerable, not less. Timing depends on your climate, and there is no national calendar date, so I'm not going to invent one. Here's an example just to show you the shape of it. Iowa State Extension tells Iowa gardeners to put about 4 inches of mulch over the crowns after the ground freezes, which in much of Iowa is late November. Then pull that blanket back in early spring once the top layer thaws. That is Iowa guidance. If you're in Georgia or Vermont or Oregon, your dates are different, and your own state extension service will have them for the tender perennials you actually grow. Now, here's the idea I most wish somebody had told me 30 years ago, and it costs nothing at all. Don't compost every leaf you own this fall. Picture next July. It's hot. You mow, and you've got a bin of wet grass clippings. You've got kitchen scraps. You've got a bucket of fresh green weeds you just pulled. All of it goes on the pile, and within a week that pile is heavy and slumped and slick, and when you open it, it hits you with a sharp ammonia smell. That pile isn't broken. It's just hungry for the opposite thing. It's drowning in green and starving for brown. And the brown material it needs is lying all over your yard right now, in October, for free. October gives you the brown material July will make you pay for, so set some aside. Both Penn State and Illinois Extension recommend this out loud. Stockpile a portion of your leaves separately, then feed them into the compost bin through spring and summer as your brown layer whenever the green material is running ahead. Storage is the whole trick, and it comes down to one word: dry. Shred them if you can, because shredded leaves take 1/4 of the space and sprinkle in evenly instead of clumping. Then get them under cover before the fall rains. Garbage cans with lids, bags in a shed corner, a bin with a scrap of plywood over the top. Once a stored pile gets soaked, it packs into a heavy slab and it's no fun to work with. On the ratio, Illinois Extension keeps it simple. Roughly 1 part green to 1 part brown, and chopping or shredding the material speeds things along. But I'd rather you didn't memorize a ratio at all. I'd rather you use your nose, because Illinois gives you a better troubleshooting guide than any formula. Off odor, add brown. Ammonia smell, add brown. Damp and sweet smelling but never heating up, add green. Bone dry and nothing happening, layer it and cover it to hold moisture. That's a compost education in 4 sentences, and your stored leaves answer 2 of them. Tonight's test. Fill 1 bag or 1 lidded can with dry leaves and put it somewhere with a roof. 1 container. That's the whole assignment. Now I owe you the other side, because everything I've told you can be done badly. This is the part I'd want a friend to tell me. First, a thick layer of whole leaves left across the lawn. It looks harmless, even tidy. What actually happens is that broad leaves get rained on, lock together, and form a mat that blocks light and holds water against the crowns all winter. Instead, mow them in while you can still see half the grass, or move the surplus to a bed. Second, wet mats around small plants. Same mechanism, worse consequences. Illinois Extension notes that unshredded leaves used as mulch tend to mat together and suffocate the soil or the plants underneath, and low crowns are what pay for it. Instead, shred whatever goes near small plants and keep it off the crown. Third, the leaf volcano at the base of a tree. It looks like generous care. What it does is keep bark wet and hide bark-chewing rodents. Instead, wide and shallow, with a clear ring at the trunk. Fourth, too much depth everywhere. More organic matter is good. More mulch is not automatically better. Past a few inches, you restrict air and water movement and hold wetness where things ought to dry. Instead, stay in that 2 to 4 inch range. Fifth, and this is the one that actually costs people a crop, known diseased leaves. A crabapple or apple that dropped scabby, blotched leaves. a rose that's spotted and defoliated. Those pathogens overwinter in the fallen material and come back up in spring. University of Minnesota Extension's guidance for apple scab is to rake and destroy the fallen leaves before the first snow. I'm not going to tell you never to compost a diseased leaf, because that's too broad. Here's the honest version. If you cannot identify the disease, or you cannot reliably run a compost pile hot enough to deal with it, don't gamble with next year's garden. Isolate that material and handle it according to your local guidance. And one small caution if you're mowing leaves into the lawn. If those chopped leaves are coming up mixed with a lot of grass from a lawn that was recently treated with a broadleaf weed killer, read that product label before you carry the mixture into your vegetable beds. Extension guidance on treated grass clippings varies with the product, and the label wins. So, it's January. The garden looks finished. What's actually going on under that blanket? Less than the internet will tell you, and more than you'd think. I'm not going to claim your soil is bustling in February the way it does in June. It isn't. Cold slows everything down, but the ground under a leaf layer is not the same place as the bare ground beside it. Under cover, the temperature swings are gentler. Moisture holds steadier instead of being pulled straight out by wind. There's carbon sitting right at the surface where the decomposers are. And there's shelter for the small creatures that will still be there in April to do the work. It's worth saying what leaves are not. The Conservation Service puts keeping soil covered right alongside keeping living roots in the ground. A blanket of leaves is not a cover crop. It covers, it buffers, it shelters, it feeds from above. That is not everything, but it is a great deal. And here is what I've come to believe after a lot of winters. The goal isn't to make your soil work hard all winter. It's to stop making winter harder on your soil. So let me hand you back everything we covered in a form you can carry out the back door. 1 yard, 3 piles. Almost nothing wasted. Pile 1. Use now. Shredded leaves going straight onto beds, around trees and shrubs, 2 to 4 inches, wide and not deep, off the trunks. Pile 2. Rot slowly. Damp, contained, and left alone, becoming leaf mold 6 to 12 months from now. Pile 3. Save dry. Under a roof, waiting for the July compost pile that's going to be drowning in grass clippings. Plus, leave some where they naturally fall, in the quiet corners where things are already wintering. And set aside anything carrying a known disease or a known risk, and handle that separately. That's it. That's the system. 1 material, and you've just given it 4 honest jobs and 1 honest exit. Now I'd like to hear from you, and I mean it. What did your family do with fall leaves when you were growing up? Burn them, pile them, dig them in, or leave them where they fell? Tell me down in the comments, because half of what I know I learned from somebody's grandmother, and I'd guess yours knew something worth passing along. And if you'd rather not remember every depth and exception we covered today, I put all of it into a short printable guide called the Fall Leaf Decision Guide. It's free. The link is down in the description, and there's a code on screen you can scan with your phone. Print it and hang it in the shed. So when that first big drift of leaves lands in your yard this fall, don't reach for the trash bag first. Give that pile a job.